Just about 1 week ago, we had a patch in Marvel Snap. This patch included the addition of the Heroes for Hire season, Daredevil, and some balance changes. Today, I want to look at those balance changes and talk about some of those cards, how they're performing now 1 week later, and how I think they're going to perform in the future. So let's jump straight into it, starting with Collector. The Collector was previously a 2 energy, 0 power card with the effect when a card enters your hand from anywhere except your hand, +2 power. They halved the amount of power gain by making it +1 power, and they gave him an additional power to kind of compensate for that in some way. This nerf did end up affecting the discard decks that were targeted by this patch very specifically. There was a discard deck that focused on both Apocalypse and Wong, with the ultimate goal being to discard multiple copies of Swarm or multiple copies of Apocalypse, and that way you get an insane amount of value from just discarding one card, because not only would your Collector get +2 power, but your Morbius would as well, and of course you would get the increased value of that individual discard because you're discarding a card like Apocalypse, which is just increasing his own power, or you're getting multiple copies of Swarm. So it makes sense that in the same patch we're, trying to balance these discard cards, that we also ended up hitting Collector because he was being used in that archetype. So I'm sure he had some pretty inflated win rates at the time. But even outside of just that package, just as a general change, I believe this is a positive thing for the game. Collector saw a lot of play in a variety of decks. I also don't think that this change is a complete nuke. Like, I think you can still perfectly play the Collector in quite a few decks. Personally, I haven't done a ton of testing since Collector's changes, but I know a lot of people have, and just intuitively, it feels like the card should still be good enough to see some amount of play in decks that specifically want to take advantage of Collector's effect. You only need to spend 2 energy on Collector, which is still extraordinarily cheap, so you only need to get a few different procs of his effect to be able to make him efficient and valuable. So in conclusion, I definitely don't think the Collector is completely gone from the game now. I think he was a good target for a nerf. The specific change itself, I think, is reasonable, and I still think the Collector will see play. Moving on to Kingpin, who probably got the most dramatic change, but it's not a rework, it's still a similar effect. And bear with me, I'm going to paraphrase this because I don't have the exact text in front of me, but Kingpin used to read, on reveal, next turn, if a card moves here, destroy it. Or when a card moves here, destroy it, something like that. But now it's been changed to when a card moves here on turn 6, destroy it, and it's no longer an on-reveal. So I'm going to hold off a lot of my opinions on Kingpin for now, because I'm working on a dedicated video for Kingpin. What I will say is that I think this change is definitely a buff. There was some confusion, or I guess confusion is not the best word, there was some discussion about whether Kingpin was a balanced nerf, buff, or like a side grade, but really, I do think it is a buff. If we do want Kingpin to be a prominent card in the constructed format, which we're definitely very far away from, I think, he's going to need some type of additional assistance, either from another buff or a newly released card that otherwise supports him. But I do think the change was for the better. Yeah, I'm going to leave it there because I think I'm going to do a dedicated video about Kingpin because I think he's a super interesting card that just isn't quite there yet. But if he's given a little bit of a push, I think he could be a really fun and interesting card. So we'll see where we go with that. And yeah, we'll talk about that more in the future. Moving on to Lizard. Lizard simply got +1 power. Nothing about his effect changed. Nothing about his energy changed. He has the exact same effect, exact same card. He just got +1 power. And honestly, I already thought Lizard was pretty decent, especially in like Spectrum combo decks that ran Wong. All that these decks care about is having cheap ongoing effects. The +1 power has a very low impact in that deck, so this change doesn't really move the needle on that deck one way or another. I'm actually really curious about why this change happened. Maybe it was something to do with bot win rates, or yeah, I'm not really sure why this change came into effect. I don't think there was very many people running Lizard. Like I said, I already thought Lizard was in a pretty decent spot. That being said, if he's able to get the +1 power, and I'm still saying that the needle doesn't move on the card, maybe the +1 power is not only reasonable, but required. Maybe he was much lower on the totem pole than I noticed. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to see the change, despite being a little bit surprised by it. Moving on to Nakia. Nakia got a pretty big change. She went from being a 3-1 that gave +2 power to every card in your hand to being a 3-1 that gives +2 power to 2 cards in your hand. The 2 cards are decided completely randomly. It's not left to right or anything like that. It's just completely randomly from cards in your hand. This is probably the biggest change of all of the changes in this entire patch. People called this the quote-unquote death of Nakia. I'm certainly not quite there. I think Nakia is still pretty decent. The decks that Nakia was previously thriving in are certainly hurt by this change, because the idea behind Nakia in the past is that you would hold your hand until turn 3. That way you got the most amount of value possible with Nakia herself. But current day Nakia still has a very powerful effect that can be built around. I mean, if you look at her just on a stat standpoint, if you assume that you get all of her stats onto the board, She's a 3/5. 3/5 is certainly playable, but it's more about targeting a specific card with that +2 power. There's only so many ways in the game right now that you can give cards in your hand +2 power, or plus any amount of power. So if you're building a deck that needs to buff cards in your hand, like a Human Torch deck, or Mr. Sinister and Brood decks, those decks only have so many options. So Nakia still probably makes it into those decks. I've actually been testing my Brood deck that I played a while ago, that I did a bit of climbing with. Even with the Nakia changes, I still think that that's a pretty reasonable deck. At the very least, it's functional enough that you can still play it and not feel like you're hurting yourself. And in addition to that, I think people forget Nakia's stats are only going to rise with the new Wakanda cards that are quote-unquote leaked that are coming in the future. I won't talk about those cards here because I'm sure I'll get to talk about them in the future, but the entire Wakanda package is built around the concept of doubling, or not necessarily just doubling, but increasing card stats while they're in your hand. And Nakia will certainly add to that strategy, so I definitely don't think Nakia is going anywhere. I think we're going to see a lot more Nakia in the future, despite her value obviously going down pretty dramatically. I think she's still going to be in a fine spot. I think we're still going to see Nakia played. Maybe not at the moment, because the meta's not in that spot right now, and we don't have those future cards that we're talking about. You know, maybe we'll see more token-focused decks thrive in the future. We're just not quite there yet. Moving on to Rescue. Rescue's changes were pretty simple. She got -1 power, but she got -1 energy. Other than that, she's the exact same card. I thought Rescue was actually fairly underrated before. I thought she was a pretty decent card. Not enough that I was really running her in any of the serious decks that I made, but I thought she was in like a fine spot. I didn't think she needed to be buffed at all. But this change does help her a lot. I don't think she's going to make a huge splash on the meta, but more aggressive decks that don't really want to empty their hand for like the strong guy buff, for example, could easily slot in a Rescue as a replacement. And she works even better in on-revealed builds, like if you wanted to run kind of like a Wong Doctor Doom rescue package. That all kind of works a lot better if you can pay 1 less energy for rescue. I think this change is awesome. It actually feels very similar to the Lizard change in my mind. I think the game would have been fine if we didn't make this change. And with this change, I'm not going to go out and rush and, you know, make all the rescue decks and all the Lizard decks. But if it's a buff, and it's not a buff that I would have thought of, and it's not a buff that I would have initially thought would be quote-unquote necessary, probably a good change. If she can exist in this space at a 4/4, which is definitely better than a 5/5, if she can exist in this space and it doesn't feel like she got majorly buffed, then she probably should have had that buff. It means there's a window in there that she can exist in, so why not have her exist in that window? Hellcow got a +2 to his energy. He was originally a 2/6. Now Hellcow is a 4/6. Hellcow was absolutely overtuned at 2/6. She single-handedly was responsible for shifting the meta towards the Wong Dracula discard archetype that we were talking about before. A lot of people feel that this card was completely gutted and that Hellcow is essentially going to be unplayable moving forward, but I don't think that's the case. I think Hellcow will still see play. Being able to discard 2 cards with just a single card effect is still very powerful, even if you're paying 4 for it, and yes, 4 is a lot of energy. Hella decks still absolutely want to run Hellcow. There's no world where that's not true, and I'm sure that won't be the only use for Hellcow moving forward. I'm sure she's still going to get a decent amount of play. It's hard to say what those decks look like now because there's going to be some adjustment period that needs to happen, but she's definitely still going to see play in, at the very least, Hella. In a vacuum, I would normally say that this change would be too dramatic, +2 energy to one of the most powerful discard cards. It probably hurts discard just a little bit too much, but thankfully the team over at Second Dinner had the foresight to make some buffs to kind of offset the discard package taking a pretty big hit. And overall, I think it definitely improved their energy curve as well. So let's take a look at these 2 last cards, also being discard cards. We're going to take a look at Colleen Wing. Colleen Wing got -1 power and -1 energy, so she went from being a 3/5 to a 2/4. I'm completely in love with this change. Targeted discard is a very powerful effect, and obviously Lady Sif is currently the winner of that targeted discard duo. She's definitely a more quote-unquote powerful card. Now that Colleen Wing sits at 2 energy, she's certainly a lot more viable than she was before. I'm really looking forward to experimenting more with this card, and I expect she's going to see a lot more play over time than she would have if she remained a 3/5. And lastly, we're going to talk about Swordmaster. Previously, I was actually pretty anti-Swordmaster. Previously, Swordmaster was a 4/7. Now he's been moved to a 3/7, so -1 on both energy and power. I was actually pretty anti-Swordmaster before, but at 3/6, I can definitely see situations where you want to run Swordmaster, especially in kind of budget-oriented decks. But even at full collection decks, I think there's certainly a case to be made for Swordmaster in specific decks. I would say before, if you were running Swordmaster, it was probably because you were making a concession somewhere in your deck. Either because you didn't have the collection for the build that you actually wanted to make, or because some other circumstance. But now I won't frown so much when I see a Swordmaster. I'll think, okay, yeah, that makes sense. So those are all the changes we got last patch and how I feel about them one whole week later. I would say that Rescue probably feels like she got the biggest win out of everybody. Obviously, most people got hits this patch rather than buffs, but that's always going to be how it is, at least for the beginning here, while we kind of iron out what the meta is supposed to look like. But overall, I'd say I really like the discard changes too. I'm happy that the curve of discard has gone down quite a lot. I will say, I'm not like a gigantic fan of both Colleen Wing and Lady Sif having the same stat line, when discarding a higher cost card is obviously the vast majority of the time better than discarding a lower cost card. But I think they're probably okay with having that little bit of overlap between the two cards. I don't think it's a huge deal. It's just something that I noticed. But yeah, I think this patch overall has definitely been good. Thank you, Second Dinner, for supporting the game and continuing to make it better every patch. I'm excited to see more, and just leave my Mr. Negative alone, okay? You leave him alone. I swear he doesn't need balance changes. I'm sure he's fine. There's no need to nerf my boy. There's no need to balance change him at all. He's doing just great where he is. You leave him alone, okay? Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, keep being awesome, and I'll catch you later.